These are the moments of which the reconciliation of spirit with its own consciousness proper is composed. By themselves, they are single and separate, and it is solely their spiritual unity that constitutes the power of this reconciliation. The last of these moments is, however, necessarily this unity itself, and as is evident, it binds them all into itself. The spirit that, in its existence, is certain of itself, has for the element of existence nothing else but this knowledge of itself. When it declares that what it does out of a conviction of duty, this utterance is the validating of its action. Action is the first implicit sundering of the simple unity of the notion and the return out of this dividedness. This first movement changes round into the second, since this element of recognition posits itself as simple knowledge of duty in antithesis to the distinction and dichotomy that lie in action as such, and so constitute a stubborn actuality confronting action. But in forgiveness, we saw how this obstinacy surrenders and renounces itself. Here, therefore, actuality as well as immediate existence has for self-consciousness no other significance than that of being a pure knowing. Similarly, as determinate existence or as relation, what is self-opposed is a knowing, partly of this purely individual self, partly of knowledge as universal. In this is posited at the same time that the third moment, the universality or essence, counts only as knowledge for each of the two sides that stand over against each other. And finally, these latter equally resolve the empty antithesis still remaining and are the knowledge of I equals I, this individual self, which is immediately a pure knowing or a universal. Paragraph 793 is bringing all these previous paragraphs in absolute knowing to a culmination. And what we're going to see is there's really two different things going on in this paragraph. We could say that really there's just a few lines that are the first thing, which concerns all these previous paragraphs and what's been going on in them, and then we launch into what seems to be, in some respects, a new dialectical progression. But it's not a new dialectical progression, because what's happening here is we're continuing in absolute knowing to review what has happened with the previous development of the shapes of consciousness, whatever we want to call them. You know, earlier sections. Sections is kind of a formal way of thinking about it. If we want to think about what the material or content, the inhalt is, it's these very complicated dialectical progressions, many of which, you know, follow upon each other and sometimes refer back to each other. It is something we talked about in just the previous paragraph. So let's start at the start. We have, as he says, this reconciliation of spirit, right? So Versöhnung, a coming back together. This is an important term for Hegel, particularly if we think about it as correlative to conflict, to being placed over and against each other, or to Entfremdung, to alienation or being made foreign to each other, right? And it's also a matter of dealing with these splittings or distinctions. So reconciliation is going to be important. And what is the reconciliation here? He talks about reconciliation of spirit. So far, so good. It's the phenomenology of spirit. With what? With its own consciousness proper, Eigentlichen. So spirit at each stage, at each development, has a particular consciousness. And, we're playing kind of fast and loose with the terminology here, as is Hegel himself, because consciousness, of course, names one of the earliest portions of the phenomenology, but it's not going away. This is a term that Hegel is employing over and over again, and it's just getting more and more complicated. So what's going on? All of the stuff that we've been charting out in the previous paragraphs of absolute knowing has referred to what he's calling momentum. Moments of this reconciliation. So, looking at it, you could say progressively going through the phenomenology, as we have been doing in this entire commentary, and as people do when they typically read through the whole text instead of just excerpting out the popular parts, but it really worked their way through. We begin with consciousness, and then we go into self-consciousness, a shorter section. Then we go into this massive reason section, an even larger spirit section, and finally culminate in religion, which we've just finished up with before getting into absolute knowing. And each of these has a whole bunch of sub-moments, many of which we have charted out in an earlier paragraph. We looked at the 3 different portions of consciousness. We talked about little bits of self-consciousness. With reason, we got a little bit more selective. We saw that there was this discussion of observing reason, then turned inward on the human being, and we've got the phrenology and physiognomy section, and then a few other bits and pieces of reason. Then we get to spirit, and we're not looking at all of spirit in our summary of it, but just parts of it. And then, we didn't actually dwell that much on the religion part, but it belongs there. So this raises a very interesting question before we get to the very interesting reveal that's happening here. He says, by themselves, they're single and separate. It's solely their spiritual unity that constitutes the power of this reconciliation. So when we read the phenomenology, and again, I just mentioned a little bit earlier the mistake of just focusing in on isolated sections and saying, "Ooh, this is so cool." What are the culprits for that? Master-slave dialectic, and then not paying attention to the rest of self-consciousness, including the much larger stoicism, skepticism, unhappy consciousness that follows, the discussion of the laws of the city and the laws of the family or the gods that replicates what's going on in the Antigone early on in the spirit section, the physiognomy and phrenology section in the reason portion of the work. Any one of these can be an isolated moment, right? And they're cool by themselves. There's a lot of interesting stuff we could dwell on, but Hegel is making the point here that if you want to see their larger meaning, if you want to see their scope, if you want to see what they actually tell us, it's got to be within this more comprehensive framework where they can be reconciled with each other in spirit for us, the phenomenologists, but also the inheritors of the cultural, intellectual, spiritual development that has taken place as consciousness has traversed all these sections, right? And often retraversed them. So by themselves, they're single and separate. It's the spiritual unity of them. And, don't think of spirit in any sort of woo-woo way. Think of it as we are the thinkers who have grasped this. Hegel is the thinker who, presumes that he has figured out the key to the development of human consciousness through history up to his point. Okay, so that's already quite a bit. Then he says something really cool. And this is where we're going to start transitioning into the second part. The last of these moments is, however, necessarily this unity itself, and as is evident, it binds them all into itself. Okay, so what is the last of these moments? Is it the religion section? No, it's the very section that we're in, absolute knowing. So that is sort of coming back upon itself. The reconciliation is possible because we're done. We've reached the endpoint of our dialectical struggles and studies and all of this sort of stuff. And I do want to pause here just for a second on thinking about something. So these moments, should we take what Hegel has chosen to highlight for us as being the most important moments of this progression? As I pointed out, he isn't actually talking about everything that's going on in self-consciousness or reason or spirit. He's not even mentioning religion as such in this, but all of these were important to go through. There's nothing in the Phenomenology, as far as we know, that Hegel afterwards was going to say, that was a blind alley. Doesn't really matter for the development of human consciousness. No, it all matters. It's all relevant. So I think we have to actually read the whole of the Phenomenology into this reconciliation of spirit with its own consciousness. Now, how does this take place? Here's where it can get a little bit tricky, because Hegel keeps talking about firsts and seconds and finally thirds and stuff like that. And so we have to be a little bit attentive to what he's actually doing. So he begins by saying, the last of these moments, the unity itself, the spirit that in its existence, in its Dasein, is certain of itself, right? So spirit that knows itself as what it is. It's overcome the alienation of itself from itself. It now has a solid grasp. So he says the spirit that is certain of itself has, for the element of existence, nothing else but this knowledge of itself. And that might make you think about like Aristotle's idea of thought thinking itself. And Hegel actually referenced that early on in the preface. So you might be like, oh, I see, we're back to idealism now. What we've got here is a thought that has managed to isolate and to free itself of all of the other stuff, the detritus that's going on, the real world, and it can focus solely on its abstraction and making sense out of this great history that it's involved in. And so there's something to that, but notice what he's going to say here. He's not saying that is the totality of the spirit that is certain of itself in existence. Rather, it has for the element of existence nothing else but this knowledge of itself. It has all sorts of other things, right? And this knowledge of itself, we should be careful in assuming that knowledge of itself is merely some sort of reflexive, abstract understanding. There's more going on here. So what does he do? He says it declares that what it does out of a conviction, Überzeugung, right, having been convinced, of duty, Pflicht. And you might say, how the hell did we get to duty? I mean, isn't that way back in the spirit and the reason section? What the hell's going on here? Well, Hegel is an idealist, but he is an idealist who understands the importance of the real and the practical, right? We are what we are through action, through Handeln. And so even the very abstract, spirit thinking itself has to declare, has to speak, aussprechen, speak about its action. It has to take a stance on itself. An action is by its very nature something that roots us, something that individuates us as well. I mean, there can be universal action, but it's individual actors that do things. So he goes on and he says, action. Well, actually, I want to bring up one other thing. what it does out of a conviction of duty, this utterance is the validating, the Geltung, right? The giving value to its action. And now we come to action. Action, he says, is the first implicit Ansichtsseiende, right? So the Ansicht, implicit sundering, trennen, splitting things apart, of what? Of the simple unity of the notion. Okay, so, something, again, abstract, the simple unity of the notion, or we could even jump ahead and say something universal. And the return out of this dividedness, and the term that's being translated there by Miller as dividedness, is the same term as he's translated as sundering, trennen, right? A splitting. So he says the first movement, now here's where it gets tricky, right? The first movement changes round into the second. Now, what's he referring to? This is where I think actually we can say both. So, first movement could be this first thing, spirit certain of itself, and then action and its splitting. It could also be the two things that have been divided apart from each other in action, simple unity of the notion and return out of dividedness. And I don't think we actually have to choose between the two, because I think they actually make sense understanding them together in this way, right? This is where we have what we could call productive or perhaps even intentional ambiguity. So action has got these two parts to it. The first movement changes round into the second. Why? The element of recognition. Now that's important, right? Anerkennen. Where have we seen this before? Well, from self-consciousness on, this is what self-consciousness desires. It hungers for recognition, and it's been trying to get that. It's been trying to give and get this the entire time that the dialectic has been going on. And this is incredibly important because we didn't get a good recognition in the self-consciousness section. Certainly not with the master-slave dialectic, right? Master can't get the recognition that they desire from the slave because the slave isn't being treated as a full person. And we go through these others and we get more complicated types of recognition. We also can bring in the notion of God and being part of a relationship with God in which we recognize God, God recognizes us. We've been looking for this in action the entire time. So he says that this element of recognition posits itself as simple knowledge of duty, in antithesis, opposed to the distinction and dichotomy that lie in action as such, and so constitute a stubborn actuality confronting action. Now, this is a reference back to what is happening implicitly in the reason section, particularly when we're looking at the last two portions of it, especially reason giving itself laws, but even more so in the spirit section, in the morality portion, where we're looking at a very detailed dialectical examination of what goes into action. And can any action be truly, entirely, totally good or fulfill duty the way it ought to? And the answer for Hegel was no, it can't. There's always something, some vantage point from which we can look at action, handeln, not just acting, doing something, but doing something intentionally with a comportment that somehow the parts don't align properly. And we're looking for a reconciliation of this. So he talks about this stubborn actuality, right? Hart, this is something that's hard. Actuality is Wirklichkeit. And then he said, in forgiveness, we saw how this obstinacy, and quite literally just hardness, harte, surrenders and renounces itself. So he goes on and he says then, actuality as well as immediate existence. Okay, so we've got the actuality on the part of action. We've got immediate existence in spirit that is certain of itself in the element of existence, which declares about its action. Both of these have no other significance than that of being a pure knowing. Now that should bring us up short. We should say, wait a second. What? We just talked about action. How the hell does that turn into a pure knowing? Here is where we want to think about what pure means for Hegel. Does it mean something like purified of any actuality whatsoever, any reality, any Wirklichkeit, any of the complex splits that have taken place? Because those splits, they happen. I mean, they can be reconciled, they can be forgiven, they can, all sorts of things, unity can be brought to them, but they do exist. They do assert themselves. They have their own Dasein, don't they? So he goes on and he says, similarly, as determinate existence, right? Existence that is no longer just something abstract, determinate, determined existence, or as, even more important, relation, right? So we've got determinate, bestimmte existence. We've got relation, connectedness to other things. Nothing is, and this was something we saw in the dialectic of action, right? Nothing is purely itself. It can be framed, it can be expressed as purely itself, but it's not purely itself. So the pure knowing is also acting. Acting not purely, but from a standpoint, right? So he goes on and says, the determinate existence, or as a relation, what is self-opposed is a knowing. What is it knowing? Well, it's a knowing of the purely individual, einzelne self, right? So who's doing this knowing? Every single one of us, as we're engaged in action, as we understand ourselves as rooted within context, as deciding things within a world that already has valuations, where we have to sort of make our way and we have to revise our action over time. And we've got this entire messy, complex stuff. But we're also, at the same time, every single one of us, spirit in its universality, right? Knowledge as, he's going to say, universal, allgemeine, right? And so, we're partly this, partly that. And he goes on and he says, in this is posited at the same time that the third moment, what is the third moment? The universality or essence counts only as knowledge for each of the two sides that stand over against each other. So the third moment exists for the other things that are standing in relation to each other. All of this matters, right? All of this is rolled into this third moment, the universal. And he says, finally, these latter equally resolve the empty antithesis still remaining. What is this empty antithesis still remaining? Well, what is the I? He says, they are the knowledge of I equals I, this individual self, which is immediately a pure knowing or universal. And this is something that confronts us as human beings all the time when we're trying to figure out who the hell are we and what is the meaning of our existence, our life, our action, our relationships with other people, our place in a long history that has shaped us and conditioned us, but has not completely determined us in our present moment. This is some really heady stuff if we unpack it. And that's part of what Hegel is trying to get us to do, trying to get us to see as we go through this absolute knowing section. So this is how he is, at this point, wrapping up the previous discussions that have been going on. All of this reconciliation of spirit with its own consciousness, all this stuff that we've had to remember, erinnern, to go back to a previous paragraph, all of that is getting rolled into now this needing to figure out, all right, what are my duties? Or we could frame it in other moral theoretic terms if we want to as well. What makes me a good person? What is the project of my life? And how is it connected with others? Here's where we'll end. In terms, not just of some sort of reconciliation, not just some sort of, equilibrium with them, but a genuine recognition of the other and the other of me as human. We can do this with ourselves, and we can think about how we would bring Hegel himself into this very process. And all of human development and history up until this point has been preparing the way for us, from Hegel's time onward, to carry this out.